so much for being here. It's a pleasure to be at a library anytime, especially on a Sunday when everybody comes from church and looks so nice. Normally folks don't look quite this nice, at least in libraries I've grown up going to. I grew up in Gastonia, North Carolina, and libraries where we went, you turned 6 years old, you got your own library card. And I can remember holding that card and thinking, I'll never be bored again for the rest of my life. And it's always a thrill to come back to libraries because they've meant everything to me. There are centers for democracy. That's what libraries are. They serve everybody. Children who can't read, adults who can't read, children who read too much, adults who read too much, people who have jobs, people who don't have jobs, people who need jobs. They're all here under one roof. So thank you for letting me be part of it, Charlotte. I want to thank Ben as well for inviting me and bringing me here. And Lee Smith, I think, gave him my email address. So I want to thank Lee as well. I thought today I'd talk a little bit about a book I had come out in October called The Last Ballad. And The Last Ballad is set in the summer of 1929. And it tells the story of a young single mother who's caught up in a violent textile mill strike. The woman's name is Ella Mae Wiggins. She's from the mountains of East Tennessee, Sevierville, Sevier County, Cott County. And she ends up in Gaston County, North Carolina as part of this migration out of the mountains that a lot of people made seeking the good life promised in the textile mills. Textile companies send barkers up into the hills, up into the lumber camps, around places like Bryson City. If you've read Ron Rash's novel Serena, you have an idea of what life was like there. My book's way better than Serena. I wouldn't even check it out if it's here. I'm kidding. That's a wonderful book. My wife and I were working on a project about modern Appalachia, and I was interviewing Ron a couple weeks ago, and she was taking his picture, which if you want to see Ron Rash be uncomfortable, get a camera out, and he'll shrinking violet. But I told him, I said, I think you're our contemporary Robert Frost. And he kind of blushed and looked away, and I was like, no, look in my eyes. You are our contemporary Robert Frost. I genuinely believe that. My book's still better than Serena, but I still believe that about his work. But so Ella found herself down in the textile mills, and in the summer of 1929, she's 28 years old when the book opened. She's given birth to 5 children. One of them has passed away. Her husband has abandoned the family for what looks like the final time. She lives in an African-American community called Stumptown. She works 72 hours a week in a textile mill on the night shift, and she earns $9. And when the novel opens, she's literally working herself to death. You know, we have this common myth about the working poor in America then and now that people don't work hard enough. Sometimes people work so hard they can't do anything else. They can't seek health care, they can't vote, they can't apply for a different job, they can't take care of their kids because they're trying to live. And that's definitely what Ella was doing, and she knew she was going to die if her life went on this way. And one day she hears about a strike at a mill in Gastonia, 7 miles to the east. And some leaflets go through the mill put out by a labor union called the National Textile Workers Union. And the list of demands the union is making are things like $20 minimum wage per week. Well, Ella earns $9. 40-hour work week. Ella works 72. Equal pay for equal work, and Ella knows there are men in the mill doing her job getting paid more than she is. Luckily, that doesn't happen anymore. We don't have to, right? We don't have to worry about that. That's old stuff. That got solved in 1929. And she has this piece of paper, and she looks at it, and she says, if this list of demands comes true, maybe my kids won't die. If this list of demands comes true, maybe I won't die. It wasn't that she wanted a Corvette and a condo in Myrtle Beach. It's just that she didn't want to die. And so she has to decide, am I going to go to this rally? Am I going to go, find out more about this labor union? Because if I'm discovered, I'll be fired. And if I'm fired, my kids might die. If I stay in this job, my kids might die. And so she really feels stuck in this untenable situation. I thought I'd read the first 75 pages. Y'all up until 6 on Sunday, right? Charlotte, is that what you said? So I'll read the first 75 pages and then we'll take a break. The bathrooms are, you buy the book, you can read along for the next, then I'll finish it. I thought I'd read a few pages early in the novel. When the novel opens, Ella's sitting outside the office at the mill. She's been called off the line on the Saturday night shift, and because she has missed the Friday night shift the night before. And she missed it because her youngest daughter, whose name is Rose, she's 3 years old, has whooping cough. And that's what killed her son, who passed away a couple years earlier. And so she stays home at night to take care of Rose. And she's asked, you'll see in this excerpt, she's asked to be put on day shift, and they won't do it. And her daughter's the sickest at night. She wants to be on the day shift to be with her. But during this scene, she's got a union leaflet in her pocket. And it's a leaflet that advertises a rally the following night in Gastonia at this mill called Lorry Mill. It's the largest mill in the county, maybe the largest mill in the state. And Ella's trying to decide whether or not she's going to go on her only day off. And after this scene, you can imagine the decision she makes. This is the scene where she's called into the office at the mill where she works. A chair set in front of Goldberg's brother's desk. Those are the two brothers who own the mill, the Goldberg brothers. But he did not ask Ella to sit down, so she did not sit. He pushed himself back from his desk and put his hands in his lap. His thin lips formed a straight line. I'm glad you joined us for your shift this evening, he said. Yes, sir, Ella said. She did not look at him when she spoke, choosing instead to focus on the other things on his desk aside from the ledger and ink pen. A small wooden globe with etchings too faded to read. An empty mug, a half-eaten sandwich of some kind, a shiny red apple. I say that because you missed last night's shift. Yes, sir, she said again. Mrs. Wiggins? He said. It's May. Her eyes darted to his for a moment, returned to rest on the half-eaten sandwich. What? It's May. Ella May. Well, I've got Wiggins written down here. It's May, she said again. I told Dobbins to change it, but I guess he didn't. Well, why have you been missing your shifts, Mrs. May? Shift, Ella said. I just missed the one last night. No, Goldberg's brother said. He leaned toward his desk, picked up a clipboard, flipped through his sheath of papers. No, you missed one in January and one in March. It's been a long time since March, Ella said. It's been even longer since January. That's not the point, he said. Why are you missing shifts? Well, I got a sick little girl at home. She gets bad at night. I had to stay home, she said. I asked Dobbins to put me on day shift, but he won't do it. Maybe I should have asked you. Dobbins handles shift change requests, he said. Well, he didn't handle mine, Ella said. And now he told me to come down here, and that's just going to set me back even more. Goldberg's brother leaned back in his chair, placed his hands in his lap again. Ella stared at the sandwich, tried to judge what kind of meat rested between the slices of bread. You have a sick little girl, he said. Yes, sir. Please look at me, Mrs. May. I can't tell whether or not you're being truthful unless you look at me. She lifted her eyes to his, saw that he stared at her intently, saw that her missed shift must mean a great deal to him. But she knew it meant even more to her, because she would not be paid. Why wouldn't I be truthful? I don't know, Mrs. May. People often don't tell the truth when they lay out of work. Sick means drunk. Sick means gambling. Sick means lazy. I don't know what a sick little girl means. She felt blood rush to her face, knew that her cheeks were flushed with color. Her guilt, or whatever it was she had just felt, faded. She imagined throwing herself across the desk, reaching for his neck, his eyes. Sick means my little girl's sick, she said. That's what it means. He stared at her for a moment, then lifted a wastebasket from beneath his desk and swept the sandwich and the apple into it. He returned the wastebasket to the floor. What if all my employees had sick children, Mrs. May? What about me? What if I had a sick child at home and decided that I couldn't come to work? Who'd run this mill? Ella had never seen Goldberg's brother's family, knew nothing about them aside from their existence and the existence of the older brother. She had never been inside the Goldbergs' large brick home, and she had never met anyone who'd been inside it either. She envisioned electric lights and running water and warm blankets and bed sheets, and a pantry full of food and a cooler full of ice, a pair of soft, warm slippers tucked beneath a neatly made bed. A baby might cry out somewhere upstairs, and a nurse or a maid or a young cousin would ascend a grand curved staircase and open a nursery door and whisper something kind and reassuring to the child inside. Yes, sir, Ella said. Who'd run this mill? Goldberg's brother asked again. Nobody. That's correct, nobody. And you know who runs your spinners when you decide to lay out on a shift? Nobody. He leaned forward again. But I can assure you of this, Mrs. Wiggins. It'll be much easier to find someone to operate your spinners than it will be to find someone to run this mill. I expect you'll keep that in mind next time you find yourself with the desire to stay home. I thought that I would read one more 75-page excerpt. Always thought it was so corny when writers couldn't find their sections in books they wanted to read from. It's like, oh, like you don't know your book, and then you publish a book and you can't find the section that you're looking for. It's kind of like a kid when all your kids' names run together. My mom's name was Sandy or Sandra, and she grew up called Sandra Barbara Joyce because that was all of her sister's names. I just answered to Sandra Barbara Joyce. So, yes, what do you need? But Ella decides to go to the rally on Sunday on her day off. And on the back of this leaflet that she's had in her pocket, she's been writing song lyrics to the tune of an old ballad called Little Mary Fagin. Some of y'all might know that song or that story of the girl in the Atlanta pencil factory. And she's been writing a song about her own experience of being a mill mother with young children and her life in the mill and the challenges she faces. And she is picked up by some union organizers from, one's from Pittsburgh and one's from New Jersey, and they're the most exotic people Ella's ever met in her entire life. She's terrified of seeming country or ignorant or backwards to them. And she tells them her life story because they ask. They ask, who are you? Why are you here? She's the only one that shows up to be taken to this rally. And she tells them she's a singer, that she grew up singing at the lumber camps, taking in laundry with her mother. She lost a child, she's been abandoned, she lives in an integrated community, or not she's the only white person who lives in this African-American community. She works for an integrated mill. So she's checking all the boxes for these communist labor organizers from New York City. You know, sing, diversity, female, you know, struggle, lost a child. And they want her to talk at this rally. They convince her to get up and tell her story at this rally because they want people at the mill in Gastonia to know the message has spread beyond Gastonia and this thing could get big. They want to increase the attention. So Ella tells her story, she sings her song, and it makes her the face of the strike. It makes her dangerous to the mill owners. It makes her own life dangerous to herself and to the people around her. That summer, Ella will go on to write and perform protest songs that Woody Guthrie would perform later, Pete Seeger would later record. She traveled to Washington, D.C. and confronted U.S. senators about the plight of working conditions and the southern mills and the plight of mothers and their children. She single-handedly integrated the union against the will of the union itself. And all of these things endangered her life and had awful consequences for her and her family. So the novel's hilarious. You can't tell. I thought I would read just a really quick, kind of lighthearted scene and then take any questions y'all might have about the book, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about Ella and how I came to know about this story after that. This is a scene where Ella is recalling the first time she has laid eyes on her love interest, her on-again, off-again love interest in the novel, this man named Charlie Shope. He's dangerous. He blew into there's a line that says Charlie Shope blew into Bessemer City the same way he'd blown into other places, and Ella knew one day he'd blow out the same way he'd blown in. And he's a bad guy. She knows he's a good-for-nothing nobody. Says she'd hit him, he'd hit her. He'd show up drunk, she'd run him off in the woods, and he'd pull a knife on her, and she'd pull a knife on him. But she says that, you know, her life is hard, and she deserves some measure of softness, and Charlie Shope is the only measure of softness she can find. And so she keeps taking him back, and he keeps taking her back. And this is a quick scene about the first time she lays eyes on Charlie Shope. And she's walking to work with her friend Violet from the community where she has her children. The first time Ella had ever laid eyes on Charlie Shope was back in February, when he catcalled her from the back of a Model T flatbed as it rumbled past on the Kings Mountain Highway. She and Violet had been crossing the field that separated Stumptown from Bessemer City on their way to work the night shift. The weather was cold and damp. The sky was white. The man's legs were covered over with a blanket. His feet dangled off the back of the truck. A battered suitcase set beside him. An old guitar rested on his lap. Ella and Violet watched him get smaller and smaller as the distance between them and the truck grew. He tipped his hat, blew a kiss, and then he was gone. They walked in silence for a moment. "What in the hell was that?" Ella had finally said. "That was a white man in a truck," Violet said. "I know that," Ella said. Who's he think he's whistling at?" "You, white girl." Violet forced out a laugh. "You think he's hollering at me? Shoot." Violet had stopped walking, had stared at Ella. Then she looked behind her in the direction of Stumptown. A few roofs were visible on the far side of the hill. She looked toward the forest on their right, the leafless trees wispy in the distance. Then she turned her eyes to the road where the truck had just passed. The air was cold. It smelled of wood smoke. Their noses ran. "What in the world else was he whistling at?" Violet said. She took a handkerchief from her pocket, blew into it. "I don't care," Ella said. "I just mind my own business." Violet smiled, put the handkerchief back in her pocket. "Come on, girl," she'd said. "We're going to be late. Neither one of us can afford that. This world ain't going to pay you in whistles." The second time Ella saw Charlie show up was the very next night in the spinning room at the mill. He sidled up to her where she stood on the line, took off his hat, and held it over his heart. He was small, not much taller than her. "I seen you yesterday," he said, his voice barely reaching over the noise of the machines. "Crossing the field with that colored girl?" Ella acted like she didn't hear him. She kept her eyes on the strands as they coiled around the bobbins. He leaned toward her, cupped a hand around his mouth. "I seen you yesterday," he hollered. Ella looked up as if she'd just realized that someone had spoken to her. "Yeah," she said. "You saw me? Good for you." "Yeah," he said. "You seen me?" Ella looked at his sweaty brown hair, his ruddy face, the gap between his front teeth when he smiled. "Where do you work?" she asked. He stood up as straight as he could. "Down in the carding room for now." She shook her head, allowed her face to register a smile. The Doffer boy came through, and she and Charlie both stepped back as he lifted the full bobbins from the spinners and replaced them with empty spindles. Ella moved quickly behind him, fixing the strands to the bobbins. Charlie followed her. "I'm just in the carding room for now," he said. "What's for now?" she asked. "The carding room," he said. "I'll be weaving here soon, and I make most of my money with my guitar anyway." "Okay," she said. He stopped following behind her, asked, "Did you see me out there on the road yesterday or not?" "If I seen you, I don't remember it," she said. "And if I remember you, I done forgot you already." "That's okay," he said. "We got all the time in the world to get acquainted. I'm going to marry you." Ella laughed and looked over at him again, noted the greasy cowlick he'd smeared down on his forehead. "I already had me one husband," she said. "Took me 10 years to run him off. I ain't got that kind of time anymore." "All right, honey," he said. She followed another smile. "I heard Dobbins is heading this way," she said. "You better go on. You don't want to get fired your first night in the carding room, especially when you ain't even in the carding room." "Hell," he said, "it'd be worth it if you keep talking. What's your name?" "Busy," she said. "Okay, Busy," he said. "I'm Charlie. Charlie Shope. But here soon you'll just be calling me sweetheart." So I grew up in Gastonia where this novel is set. Everything I've told you today is true. This is based on the true story of the Wiley mill strike in 1929. Ella Mae Wiggins was a real person. The only thing I've told you that's not true is she didn't have 5 children. She had 9 children, and 4 of them died from pellagra and whooping cough, which were diseases that affected poor people who were malnourished, who couldn't afford a sufficient diet. So I grew up in Gastonia. My parents were both born in mill villages, if you're familiar with the area. My mom was born in Gastonia. My father was born in Shelby. And I had never heard a word of the Wiley mill strike. It was one of the seminal labor movements in American history. It was a communist-led mill strike, which meant that it took its directives directly from Moscow. It was led by the American Communist Party. On New Year's Day, 1929, a man named Fred Beale, who'd been part of strikes in New Bedford and the Passaic strike, showed up in Gastonia looking for a mill to organize in the South. They wanted to try to organize a Southern mill. And somebody told him, if you can organize Lore, you can organize the entire South. Lore was one of the biggest mills in the country at 600,000 square feet. It had been built in 1900, but by the 19-teens, the late teens, it had been sold to a Rhode Island company that instituted some practices that were foreign to Southern workers. The first thing they did was they put up a chain-link fence around the mill. They made it against the rules to leave during your breaks to go home and check on your children. This was at a time when most of all the families in the village worked in the mill, and so young children, 3, 4 years old, were home alone at night. They wouldn't allow you to go home and check on your kids. They instituted the stretch out, which mechanized the labor and made fewer people responsible for greater output. And so wages fell, unemployment rose, and the mills made more money than ever. And the workers knew that, and they wanted to change. They were literally, Lore was one of the worst conditions in North Carolina, certainly in the region, and it was powder keg. So when the National Textile Workers Union showed up, people were excited, and they voted to strike on April Fool's Day, April 1st, 1929. The night shift walked out, and they never shut the mill down, but it was a very contentious summer, and Ella became the face of it. She became secretary of the union. She did travel to D.C., confronted a North Carolina senator named Lee Overman, who at the time when she confronted him was leading a tour group of young women from the Teachers College in Greensboro. And Ella shouted him down and interrupted the tour and demanded that he really take care of all the young women in North Carolina, not just the rich ones. She worked with her neighbors in Stumptown to integrate the union with African American organizers from the North against the will of the union. And then on the night of June 6th, there was a strike. There was a raid on the strikers' headquarters, and the police chief was shot and killed. And Gastonia and the Lore strike made headlines in every major newspaper around the world. It would go on to make headlines again later that summer when tragedy struck again. So all these things happened, and I grew up in the town. I knew the Lore building as the Firestone plant. Firestone bought it in 1938, changed the name of the plant, changed the name of the streets. I'd never heard the word Lore in my life. My parents had never heard of the strike. My mother's maiden name is Wiggins. My grandfather, Harry Wiggins, worked at a mill about 30 minutes away from Lore. He was 22 years old the summer of the strike, and he never talked about it. People just didn't talk about it. And when I went to graduate school in Louisiana, I had a professor ask me where I was from, one of my first days there, and I said, I'm from Gastonia, North Carolina. And he said, oh, home of the Lore Mill strike. I'm a new graduate student, and I said, yes, of course. So I Googled it and discovered that all of these things had happened and no one had ever talked about it. And so this was in 2003, and I wanted to write about this strike and about this woman and about this struggle, but I didn't think I was ready. I'd never written a book. I had gone down there, as Jim said, to study under Ernest Gaines. I was writing stories, bad stories. And I didn't really think about writing about North Carolina or writing about a place until I left it. And then I left the place that I knew, the place I was comfortable, and I was desperately homesick. And so I looked back to North Carolina, Western North Carolina, to find my place, to kind of recall and get to visit when I sat down at my desk. And so I wrote 2 books before I wrote this one, and I was kind of learning how to write a book and how to move a novel along and how to thread all these things together. And so I worked on this book for about 5 years, and it came out in October. So that's kind of the story of the novel and the story of Ella May. She still has some descendants around. I've met 2 of them and spoken to another on the phone. I had the release for the novel in Asheville, North Carolina, and Ella's great-granddaughter, whose name is Christina Horton, who wrote a wonderful book about the strike called Martyr of the Lore Mill. It came out, it was a nonfiction book, came out the year before my book did. She wrote me on Facebook and said, I'm going to come to your event in Asheville. And I thought, to kill me? This is Ella May's great-granddaughter. I thought, I know Ella May was tough, and tough doesn't, you can't breed that out. That's going to be, I don't know how this is going to go. But she was wonderful, and she's really embraced the book, which I'm endlessly appreciative of. But this is something that Gastonia as a city is just now kind of coming to terms with. The mill's been renovated into high-end luxury apartments for the expendable income that's in Gastonia. I don't know who it belongs to, but apparently it's there because it's full. But it's a story that's still kind of evolving. It's still we're still kind of discovering a lot of things about it. So I'd love to take any questions y'all might have about the book or publishing or agents or writing. Or I heard you have Adriana coming and Silas. I was with Silas this week up in Swain County, North Carolina, and I've done a number of events with Adriana, so I'm proud to be their opening act. I did an event one time in Shelby, North Carolina. My dad's from Shelby, and Ron Rash, I'm sure y'all know Ron's work, he was coming a few weeks after me, and I said, I am so proud to be Ron Rash's opening act. He's had a huge effect on me. He kind of paved the way for writers to come behind him. And after my event, a woman came up and she said, I'm Ron's mom. And I said, Ron who? And she said, Ron Rash. And I said, you came to see me? And my parents are there. I was like, my parents are supposed to be here. You're not. Why are you here? Bit of a surprise. But y'all are in for a treat with Silas and Adriana. I'm sure you probably have seen both of them numerous times, but they're fantastic. They're just, she's a dynamo. So. But if anybody has any questions about the book or, yes, Janice.
I'll get it started. So how much were you in an archives to do this? I know that you probably found lots of newspaper clippings.
Mm-hmm.
And had you read Christina's, you hadn't read Christina's book by the time yours was done, right?
The new one, Pieces of the World?
Yeah.
No, that came out, I guess that came out, I don't know if that came out before mine. It came out before mine, but I hadn't read that one yet. But Christina Baker Klein, who wrote The Orphan Train, I'm sure y'all know that book. It only sold like 100 billion copies. It's like the McDonald's sign. They update it every couple of days to say billions and billions read. You say Christina Horton. I'm sorry. I thought you meant Christina Baker Klein. I did read her book, Christina Horton's book, yes. I read that probably a year and a half before my book came out. I got it as soon as it came out and just tore through it. And it does a great job of telling stories that I hadn't yet known, and it's got some incredible photographs in it that I had never seen. She really did a much deeper dive than I did, especially in terms of original resources. But I didn't meet her, and I didn't really talk to any of Ella's descendants because I didn't want to write a hagiography of Ella May. I didn't want to be beholden to the way her family viewed her, because, you know, everybody is sainted when they pass on, especially when they're literally a martyr for a cause. But I knew Ella was tough. She would have to be to stay alive. And I wanted to find the historical Ella and not so much an anecdotal Ella that family members had passed around. But I thought you meant Christina Baker Klein from The Orphan Train, who I did an event with a couple of months ago. But an interesting story about Christina Baker Klein, I was in Philadelphia for a library event years ago, and I had met her for the first time, and she's so nice. And she said, what are you working on? And I said, I'm working on this novel about a mill strike in my hometown. And she said, where are you from? And I said, Gastonia, North Carolina. And she said, so is my mom. My mom did her PhD study on that strike. And so that was an interesting, it's like, everybody knows about this. How do I not know? Why not know about this? So, yeah. Yeah, Jim?
Do you think any of your books will be made into a movie?
I don't know, Jim. That's not my decision to make. You know, the movie business is, you know, I've had some friends whose books have been turned into movies, and then I've had friends whose stuff gets optioned. Like Ernest Gaines, he has a book called Of Love and Dust. It's been optioned since the day it came out in 1967. It just gets re-upped every year. I think somebody like Mel Brooks owns the option. A comedian owns this like tragic Southwest Louisiana racial romance novel. But you know, I don't know. My second book's been optioned twice, and both options expired. And my literary agent is old school New York, just like burn it down, take the money and run, kid. And he agented $1 Million Baby and LA Confidential and Black Dahlia and Nobody's Fool. And so I joke that unless like the Coen brothers were scouting locations, he wouldn't tell me. He just doesn't tell me things until there's something to tell me. And so sometimes from my editor I'll hear like, did Nat tell you Sony called about Landmark High? And I'm like, no, he didn't. And I'm glad he didn't, because I would have thought about it. I would have told my wife, and we would have talked about it, and we would have said, what if? And so I don't know, you know, I don't know. And the movie business is so foreign to me, you know. It's so foreign to me.
Wiley's kind of laid back. But before the day is over, I will be talking to my son, Scott Cooper, who got a copy of Wiley's book, A Land. And we're going to put the two of them together and see if we can't make a movie out of it. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah, stay tuned. Fingers crossed. You know, I just write books. And then I cross my fingers. So we'll see. That'd be wonderful. Yeah, I'm sorry. Somebody.
About Ernest Gaines,
Mhm.
can you talk about that?
Sure. He.
And he's no longer alive, right?
Yeah, he is.
He's
He
still
is. Yeah.
alive.
As far as I know, I was with him. Heard from him a couple of weeks ago. I guess I don't know. But he, you know, he changed my life. When I was an undergrad at UNC Asheville, you know, I grew up hearing my parents and my grandparents. I grew up in the suburbs, right? And I grew up hearing my grandparents and my parents talk about farms and mills and hard living and being a tenant farmer and, you know, living in a mill village. And here I am growing up in the suburbs in my little plot of green, you know, chemically fed green grass and walking to my school and playing with kids and having a pretty easy lifestyle. And then when I read Gaines's first story collection, Bloodline, when I was probably 19. And I found something, even though it was about African American life in Southwest Louisiana between the wars, it felt like the stories that my parents told me and the stories that my grandparents told me. And I had an article come out in a magazine called Garden and Gun in the fall about, he had a book come out just a few months before my most recent book came out. And he was writer in residence in Louisiana, and I'm writer in residence at UNC Asheville, so there's this strange, wonderful symmetry, I guess. And I said that, you know, when I was a young writer, I had never read Ron Rash. I had never read Lee Smith. Cold Mountain hadn't come out yet. I didn't know that people were doing that. I didn't know that people were telling stories. Like Ron and my dad were born in the same town, but I didn't know Ron's stuff. But I knew Chekhov, right? Writing about peasant life in Russia, that felt familiar. I had read Gaines, and that felt very familiar. And so I read Bloodline, and then I wrote a story about a young black guy on a plantation in Louisiana, like using a machete to cut sugar cane. I had no idea what I was writing, but it felt like I should try that, you know. And then I actually went to Louisiana, and every year on All Saints Day, Gaines and his wife would host like a decoration day for this old cemetery on his property he owns. It's where his ancestors are buried. And so I was up there one time using a machete to hack away at some sugar cane, and I turned this, you know, trimming it back away from the graves, and I turned around and some of these good old boys he grew up with were sitting there and just watching me, just curious, just like these looks on their face like, who is this guy? And I turned around and I said, hey, and they said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from North Carolina. And they said, they don't have machetes in North Carolina? But I went down there to study under him, and I've joked with him that he's my direct and literary ancestor. I think of all the writers, you could draw the most straight line from what he does with scene and dialogue and character and time and memory to me, you know. And I was joking that he calls William Faulkner his old man. So I said, I don't want to offend you, but you're kind of my old man. So, yes.
What do you like about Thomas Wolfe?
What do I like about Thomas Wolfe? Thomas Wolfe is, you know, when I left North Carolina in 2003, I had never read Look Home, an Angel. And then when I left, I did. I had read it one time. I'd read it one time just before I left. And it was good. I kind of put it away. And then when I left, I realized that everything I missed about Asheville was in that book. And I could read that and feel like I was back in a city that I loved, right? And I could read that and read about seasons, and what I love about Thomas Wolfe is, no matter what you read by Thomas Wolfe, it's always October or it's April, because those are the months when change happens. It's always October or April, and those are the best months, probably to be in Abingdon, to be in Asheville or a place like that. And so when I went down to Louisiana, I took Look Homeward Angel with me, and I could read it whenever I was homesick, and it just made such a huge impression on me. And although prose-wise, I'm sure I'm influenced by him, but I don't steal from him the way I steal from Gaines or somebody else. The idea of trying to condense human experience into words is something that I got from Wolfe, and how to circle back through memory. So the last ballad, all of the characters, and this novel has a ton of characters in it. I tried to write about the historical moment in 1929 and all the competing forces and interests. There's an African-American labor organizer from New York City. There's a wealthy mill owner who gets involved. He believes himself very progressive until he's called upon to kind of deliver upon these ideals. Ella's oldest daughter in 2012 is looking back on the shame of being Ella Mae's daughter and dealing with that. But what I really tried to do was the same thing that Wolfe does in a long story called The Web of Earth. It's a woman just talking to her son who's listening to her, and the narrative just cycles through time, and they're sitting still, but it's like a whirlwind or a tornado, this gentle tornado of time and image and memory and the intricacy of experience. And so each time someone in the novel is introduced, they're static. They're not moving, but their mind is circling. And my editor kept asking me, over the 5 years we worked on this, I wrote in the book in the acknowledgments that I think this book was as hard to edit as it was to write, because I was just giving him just so much stuff, and some of it was awful. He kept saying, "What do you want this novel to feel like?" And I said, "I just want it to feel rich. I just want it to feel rich, and I wanted it to feel like life. I wanted you to forget, and I have too. It sounds self-indulgent to say it as the author, but there are parts of this book that I will forget, and then I will remember them. And it feels like life when you forget something and you remember it. And I hope the reader feels that way. So that's what I got from Wolfe. Yes, sir.
Wiley, I'm wondering if you could say a little something about A Land More Kind. It seems that the last ballad is sort of biographical.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Land More Kind autobiographical?
Probably, yeah. I wrote A Land More Kind Than Home. It's the first book I ever wrote, first book I ever tried to write. And I got the idea from when I was in graduate school. I was taking a class in African American literature, and we had just read James Baldwin's novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. And I'm sure some of y'all know that book. And that book ends with this little boy having a coming through experience of like getting salvation, and it's very performative. It's essentially a southern church. It's a northern city, but it's a southern church. And it's performative in that it's like a ceremonial thing, right? And the reader wonders, is this real or not, or is this young boy trying to impress his father, and he's caught up in the performance of faith instead of the real embracing of faith. And then the next class, that professor, who I'm still really close with, brought in a story out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where a young boy with autism was smothered at an African-American church, at a storefront church, the kind of church, and we have these in the South, and because of the Great Migration, we have these churches in the North. In the North, they're primarily African-American. In the South, they're white and black. But it's the kind of church where the preacher hears the call on Friday, gets the Bible on Saturday, starts preaching on Sunday, right? One of those places. And this little boy didn't want to be touched. They were laying hands on him, and that's a tradition I grew up with in the Baptist church. And they were laying hands on him, and he didn't want to be touched, and so they fought him, And so they laid him on the floor, and then ended up laying across his body. And when they were done, he had cracked a rib and punctured a lung, and he died as a result of it. And I was really this was in the fall of 2003, and I was really interested in that story, because I was raised in the Baptist church, and I've seen people lay hands, I've seen people speak in tongues. I grew up that being relatively normal. It didn't jar me, it didn't shock me. It still doesn't. And I wanted to tell the story of that little boy, and I wanted to write about a community of believers that would literally believe something to death. that would take their beliefs so far as to tell a little boy, you're wrong, right? You don't want us to touch you, but you're wrong. And you're so wrong that by the time we're done being right, you're going to be dead. That's how strong our convictions are. And I was interested in a mother or father who would do that, who would believe that. I was interested in a spiritual leader who would oversee that. But I couldn't go to Milwaukee. I couldn't write about a place I didn't know. I couldn't write about the African American experience. It's not mine. I couldn't set it in Lafayette because they don't have churches like that there that I knew about. And I thought, gosh, I want to write about this. And I thought, I can set it in North Carolina, And if I set it in North Carolina, I can write about a place that I know, right? I can write about people's how they speak, what the land looks like, what their cultural beliefs are, and I can sit down at my desk and reanimate all the things that I miss about being back home, and then I can tell the story. And so I started writing that book, and it's an autobiographical book in a lot of ways. There's 3 characters in the novel. There is the local sheriff, who's an outsider. He's only lived in Madison County for 25 years. Y'all don't know anything about that here, do you? People don't quite trust him. But he is charged with finding out, what was this little boy doing inside a church that's where children are explicitly forbidden. The children are held separate. Why was this little boy inside there? Why is nobody talking about it? Why is the boy's mother not making herself available? And then the second narrator is a woman who's 81 years old. She's the church matriarch. She's kind of the cultural conscience. And she is the one who took the children out of the church when the practices turned, right? When they started handling snakes and drinking poison. It's a Pentecostal holiness church where they take up these practices because they believe they're the literal truth of the Bible. And then the third narrator is the boy's younger brother, who's 9. And he knows things about why his brother was inside there. He knows things that the adults do not know. And what I always found interesting and kind of satisfying is that he protects the adults. He protects his mom and keeps things from her. And there's a line, it says, do you still have to believe in miracles even when you know they're not true? And then he asks himself that. And the book said in 1986, he's 9 years old, I was 9 in 1986. And I grew up with PTO and Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart and Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. And I grew up with the people in my church saying things like, oh, the devil's working on Jim Baker. Devil's working on him. And even I was 9 years old and I was thinking, maybe? Or maybe the devil was like, you know what? I'm going to stay home today. Jim's doing just fine. Put my feet up. I'm going to check on Jimmy. He's fine. Jimmy's fine down there in Baton Rouge. These guys are making it easy on me. And so I was raised, where you mature, you're not supposed to know about untoward adult behavior. But I was raised in a church where adults during the altar call would get up together and admit untoward behavior. Right? So as kids, we weren't supposed to do the things the adults were telling us they were doing when we were sitting in church, right? So I grew up with this questioning, right? And it doesn't stop in the church. I'm from North Carolina. We have John Edwards. John Edwards was almost vice presidential candidate with Obama. And then this thing happens. We have Bernie Madoff. We have finance. We have Ted Haggard down in Texas, Arizona 1. This happens over and over. The only surprising thing about it is that we keep believing it. We keep falling for it, And so I was really interested in that. I was really interested in seeming and not being. The state motto of North Carolina is to be rather than to seem. But we have a history of seeming and not being as well. So, yeah, please.
Well, like just about every place in the South and every time, race is a matter that was of great import at the strike in Gastonia. I wonder, on your reflecting on your writing about this and the research you did, if you came to any new insights about your hometown or about the South in general about race.
Some of the things that I came up against, I knew